happens when a hospital becomes victim to a natural disaster or man-made event and can no longer provide care to its patients? What happens when instead of supporting first responders during an emergency, the hospital itself needs to be evacuated? This introduction to hospital evacuation training will lay the groundwork so that with the proper implementation and routine exercises, you can complete an evacuation event with minimal risk to your staff, patients, and visitors. By definition, an evacuation is the process of moving patients, staff, and visitors from their at-risk location within a medical facility or campus to a safe holding area or alternate location, either within the hospital or in another medical facility, which may or may not be a hospital. Partial or complete hospital evacuations are most commonly a result of internal fires, loss of utilities, hazardous materials events, hurricanes, earthquakes, and human threats. Hurricanes, wildfires, and floods pose threats that may allow some time for evacuation, while earthquakes, tornadoes, and building fires require immediate action. According to one study, more than 50% of hospital evacuations occurred because of hazards originating in the hospital or from human intruders. A great deal goes into the decision to evacuate. Total emergent evacuation of your facility should be a last resort. There are alternatives to evacuation, as well as variables in the extent and speed of the evacuation process. If the first thing you do in an evacuation is start moving patients out of their rooms, you may be destined for chaos. Conversely, if the issue is a small, localized event, moving a couple of patients quickly past the closest fire door may be all that's required. Deciding whether or not to partially or completely evacuate a hospital is a complex issue. One must ultimately balance the nature of the threat against the risk to patients and staff. The risks associated with a hurricane or flood are often better known and predicted as compared to a hazardous material release in which the toxicity of the agent and its movement may be completely unknown. The risks to patients, staff, and visitors must be considered in deciding if and when to evacuate. Evacuating too soon may place patients and staff needlessly at risk if the potential threat does not materialize. Evacuating at the same time as the general public may increase the risk to patients' health and safety if traffic congestion and other road complications increase travel time. Finally, evacuating too late increases risk if patients do not arrive at their destination before a storm or hazard strikes. A hospital evacuation requires time, labor-intensive resources, and materials at levels that most hospitals don't possess for routine emergencies. The physical act of evacuation typically shifts healthcare professionals from providing care to tasks where they are less familiar or often untrained. Transportation resources and routes of evacuation may be unavailable or designated to other public safety issues. Needed staff may be inaccessible or diverted from their primary healthcare focus because of their own need to evacuate. Finally, the full scope of the threat may not be known, is constantly changing, and often extremely difficult to predict. Not every hospital evacuation is necessarily an emergency. Usually, the more a facility can keep an evacuation from becoming an emergency, the less disruption, chaos, and impact the event will have on patients and staff. Consider, for example, the differences between evacuating a coastal hospital calmly 2 days before an impending storm, as opposed to waiting until the first floor and surrounding streets are flooded, power is out, and evacuation must take place in the dark by boat. Planning for a hospital evacuation is made easier by first understanding the circumstances under which a facility may be forced to evacuate. The classic definition of disaster relates to an imbalance of needs and resources. Not enough resources, such as staff, space, time, money, or equipment, to meet the needs of a given situation in an acceptable time period. Similarly, the critical factor in establishing types of evacuations relates to the amount of time available to mobilize sufficient resources to accomplish the evacuation. A hospital is inherently designed to be a safe facility, intended to shelter its occupants from external harm. However, an incident or situation may arise, either internally or externally, that may create a hazard to the occupants. For example, a power outage or flood may impede the delivery of medical care, while a fire, earthquake, or large-scale hazardous material release may pose a serious life safety threat. The general consideration is that keeping patients and staff within the hospital is preferable to leaving the facility, provided that it can be accomplished without placing occupants at a greater or unacceptable risk. There are several alternatives to facility evacuation that should be considered prior to ordering an evacuation. Defend in place, also known as shelter in place, involves isolating the facility or space within the facility from an external threat. Defend-in-place actions might include locking down the facility or secure space within the facility to protect from an external crowd or security threat. It may also include shutting windows and closing ventilation systems to outside airflow to protect occupants from an airborne hazardous material threat or smoke from an external fire. This action is also commonly taken during a tornado warning, where the immediate actions taken are to cover each patient with a blanket to protect from broken glass, and move them quickly away from the windows into the interior hallway outside their rooms or a designated safe location. Establish a buffer zone. Creation of a safety buffer zone around the hospital may be effective in isolating the facility during community emergency situations or civil unrest. Doing so may provide sufficient time to effect a more safe and orderly evacuation. For a flood threat, a buffer zone may be created using sandbags or other flood barriers. Add resources. Allocation of government and/or private resources may alleviate the need for partial or complete evacuation. As an example, rather than evacuate a hospital with no water, tankers and truckloads of bottled water are brought to the facility and distributed as needed. Partial or localized relocation. When portions of a facility are determined to be damaged and unsafe, as might occur following a fire or earthquake, the incident commander may order relocation of patients and staff to safe, unaffected areas of the hospital. This may allow time for a more thorough engineering assessment and occupancy determination, avoiding an urgent or emergent departure. For a lower floor threat, such as a flash flood, relocation of patients to upper floors may be an effective strategy. Using past hurricane evacuations as examples, some East Coast and Gulf Coast facilities combined partial evacuations with defend-in-place strategies. These hospitals evacuated their less critical patients and opted to shelter in place those critical care patients who would be at greater risk during an evacuation. In this way, they were able to maximize the resources committed to caring for the reduced patient population. Alteration in the standard of care. This strategy includes implementing severely altered patient care measures or a graceful degradation in the level of medical care provided. These strategies are only to be used after contemplating all other options. Such a strategy might be appropriate under circumstances where all regional medical facilities are similarly affected, and thus evacuation would be an ineffective option to improve the level or environment of care. Consider a facility experiencing severe staffing shortages during a severe infectious disease outbreak. While evacuating and shutting down the facility may be an option, it is likely that all other potential receiving facilities are experiencing similar conditions. Therefore, keeping the hospital open while increasing the patient-to-clinician ratio, altering the standard of care, may be a strategy worthy of consideration. The incident commander should consult with the medical care director and appropriate medical technical specialists prior to any such actions. In an emergent evacuation, where any delay in decision-making or movement may be life-threatening, the choice to evacuate the area immediately affected may be made by the person in charge in that area. This may be the charge nurse or department manager. Such authority shall be limited to the extent necessary to safely remove all occupants from immediate harm. The person ordering the emergent evacuation of a space is designated the evacuation group supervisor for that space. This person is responsible for ensuring that appropriate initial notifications are made, like calling for help, that the space is evacuated to the extent achievable based on conditions, and that accountability is established and maintained for all of the space's occupants. For a clinical space, the evacuation group supervisor is also responsible for ensuring that continuity of care is maintained to the extent possible during the emergent evacuation process. If the situation comes under control and the impacted area is deemed safe to return, as typically occurs after a tornado warning, the evacuation group supervisor oversees the movement of patients back into their rooms. For events that remain unstable or require additional logistical patient movement and evacuation considerations, the evacuation group supervisor comes under the direction of the evacuation branch of the incident command system once established. This will be described later. Under any other circumstances, non-emergent evacuations inherently contain an element of control and opportunity to plan prior to execution. For a planned or urgent evacuation, the authority to evacuate is held by leadership in the following order: the Chief Executive Officer, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Nursing Officer, or, if the above are unavailable, by the Incident Commander. This does not indicate that these individuals assume the role of Incident Commander. They simply have the authority to order an evacuation. The amount of lead time a facility has to orchestrate an evacuation impacts every step in the planning and response process. Lead time is defined as the time between the initiation of the evacuation process and its completion. Any evacuation of patients may be expected to take a certain amount of time. Major elements of this time include mobilizing staff, transportation resources, alternate destinations, and the patients themselves. A number of circumstances may contribute exponentially to this time factor, such as inclement weather, staff shortages, loss of electrical power, limited transportation assets, or long travel distances. A non-emergent, full-scale evacuation of the facility may take many hours. For this reason, when considering an urgent or planned evacuation, leadership should recognize the given window of time before the facility must be vacant and plan accordingly. For example, when evacuating the facility in anticipation of an impending hurricane, sufficient time must be allowed to ensure that all occupants, including staff, are clear and the facility is safely shut down and secured prior to the arrival of sustained tropical storm force winds, which may be 6 to 12 hours earlier than the actual arrival of the hurricane. Thus, if the evacuation is expected to take 12 hours, the latest possible time to start moving patients may be 24 hours prior to expected hurricane landfall. This means that resources must be mobilized and plans in place still earlier, perhaps 30 hours before landfall. The keys to effective lead time management include planning ahead to understand and optimize the time needed and available to accomplish the mission, calling in resources early, especially staff and transportation assets, anticipating delays and disruptions to this complicated process, and building in extra time and resources to offset them, and practicing, drilling, and exercising the various concepts and processes to optimize familiarity and reduce the time lost to a learning curve during a crisis. To fully appreciate the various facets of hospital evacuation, a few terms and concepts need to be provided now, but will be described in greater detail in other courses. We will begin with the concept of patient movement teams. A movement team consists of all personnel and resources, such as wheelchairs, evacuation sleds, portable oxygen tanks, and so forth, that are assembled to actually move patients from place to place during an evacuation. Horizontal movement teams will move patients from a unit to a designated patient holding area on the affected floor. Vertical movement teams will move patients from a patient holding area on the affected floor to a patient loading area on the ground floor. The evacuation branch is the organizational element of the Hospital Incident Command System, which is responsible for carrying out the evacuation. Led by the Evacuation Branch Director, the Evacuation Branch reports organizationally to the Operations Section Chief, or Incident Commander. An Evacuation Operations Center, or EVOC, is a coordination and control center for evacuation activities. It is established by the Evacuation Branch Director at the nearest practical location to the unit or area being evacuated and is initiated to remove the associated chaos from the hospital command center. In the Incident Command System, Unified Command is a cooperative team effort which allows all agencies with responsibility for the incident, either geographical or functional, to manage an incident by establishing a common set of incident objectives and strategies. In the hospital emergency setting, the Hospital Incident Command leadership should work in a unified command environment with leadership of public safety response agencies, such as fire, EMS, or police, to manage an incident or evacuation. Evacuation is always a decision of last resort. Beyond an emergent situation, the decision to evacuate should be made at the executive level if time permits. Various factors that influence the decision and timing of evacuation were presented in this course, along with alternatives to evacuation that should always be considered. In addition, this training introduced key evacuation concepts, including movement teams and the evacuation branch. In subsequent courses, we will be addressing planning, emergent and non-emergent evacuation, incident management, and evacuation logistics in greater detail. Forms will be used in the patient loading areas to verify onward destinations and mode of transport. Remember that all of today's technological systems originated with paper systems, so any of them can readily fall back to paper-tracked systems if technology is not available. Most patients' personal property, other than prosthesis or assistive devices, will not be transported during a brief evacuation. It will be left behind, safeguarded by the hospital, and returned to the patient once the hospital is reopened. Hospital plans should specify the process to track the arrival of each patient at their predetermined ultimate destination. They should also specify the plan for patient repatriation to the original facility when the hospital returns to operational status. The tracking form used should contain key patient information, such as their medical record number or identifier, indication as to whether or not the original chart was sent with the patient, the time the patient left the facility, and the name of the transporting provider. In addition, the form should include a list of medications sent with the patient, whether or not the family has been notified of the transfer, and their contact information. As conditions evolve during an evacuation, give consideration to relocating several incident facilities. Establish an alternate hospital command center, as well as a public information area and labor pool area at the receiving facility that is closest to the transferring hospital. This will expedite the evacuation, recovery, and repatriation processes by enabling the command and control element to remain operational without interruption. In this course, we have presented the role, focus, and functions of incident management in the process of hospital evacuation, and continued with the functions of incident communications, staff mobilization, and patient tracking. In the final training course, logistical considerations specific to hospital evacuation will be presented.